Mara, a 29-year-old graphic designer living in a cramped apartment in Portland, had spent the day hunched over her wooden drafting table, sunlight fading through the rain-streaked window behind her. The room smelled faintly of damp cardboard, old coffee, and the lingering musk of yesterday's storm. She rubbed at her left elbow absently, feeling a prickling warmth that seemed to pulse beneath her skin. At first, she dismissed it as a bruise or irritation from resting it too long on the edge of the table while sketching. But when she shifted, trying to rub the spot with her thumb, there was a subtle, almost metallic resistance under her fingertips, like pressing into soft clay with tiny, hidden stones embedded. Mara flexed her arm and felt a brief, unpleasant throb that made her pause, her heartbeat sinking unnaturally with a minor pulse emanating from beneath the skin. She shivered, glancing at the small mirror perched on a shelf beside her workstation. In the dim, diffuse light, she thought she saw the faintest blush of purple spreading across her elbow, almost imperceptible, but enough to trigger a quick, irrational sense of panic. She shook her head, chuckling uneasily at herself, attributing the sensation to stress, to fatigue, maybe to the copious amounts of caffeine she had ingested to meet a looming deadline. Hours passed and the rain drummed steadily against the window, a monotonous, wet percussion that seemed to underscore the faint discomfort emanating from her elbow. She continued to work, adjusting her position constantly, trying to ignore the sensation, but it seemed to creep, spreading slightly toward the forearm and up the inner arm. The warmth beneath the skin grew slightly more pronounced, almost hot to the touch, as though the blood beneath it had thickened or something unknown stirred beneath. Mara's focus faltered, lines on her sketches wavered, colors bled unintentionally, and her usually meticulous attention to detail faltered. She flexed her fingers experimentally, tracing the contours of the lump, feeling a subtle undulation, a movement so faint she wasn't sure if it was real or her imagination. A faint, wet sound, almost like the whisper of tissue rubbing against itself, echoed in the quiet room, but when she lifted her head, the apartment was empty save for the shadows cast by her desk lamp and the furniture pressed against the walls. By evening, the discomfort had intensified. Mara attempted to take a shower, the warmth of the water intended to soothe her stiff muscles, but as she ran the soap across her skin, she recoiled at the sticky, almost clinging sensation she felt along her elbow. A tiny bead of clear, viscous fluid surfaced at the peak of the small bump, glistening unnaturally under the bathroom light. Her breath hitched, the faintest nausea twisting her stomach as she realized the lump was growing, spreading outward imperceptibly, altering the once familiar lines of her arm. She tried to scrape it gently with her fingernail, but the skin resisted, yielding slightly before recoiling, almost as if alive. The smell hit her then, faint at first, metallic and oddly sharp, like rust blended with burnt plastic. Mara gagged, gripping the sink edge to steady herself, staring at the strange protrusion that now seemed to shimmer faintly under the stark bathroom lighting. She attempted to shake it off as a minor infection, a pimple, something temporary, but the unease deep in her gut refused to be ignored. Dinner was a forgotten ritual. She nibbled mechanically at a sandwich while seated cross-legged on the sofa, trying to maintain distance between herself and her elbow. But the pressure of even resting the arm on her leg caused a new throb, subtle but insistent, like tiny muscles or sinews shifting beneath the skin, working independently of her own control. She caught herself staring at the spot for minutes, eyes tracing the contours, the delicate folds of skin starting to redden and glisten. The movement, imperceptible to anyone else, was terrifyingly obvious to her. A subtle twitch, a quiver that seemed synchronized with the rhythm of her pulse. A brief, sharp itch forced her hand to jerk involuntarily. When she withdrew it, a thin, almost translucent thread of fluid clung to her fingertip. She pressed her palm against her mouth to suppress a retch, and the sound of the rain outside grew oppressive, each drop against the windowpane like a drumbeat, echoing the irregular throb in her arm. Sleep was impossible. Mara lay on her back in the darkened apartment, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a wall clock her only companions. Her elbow pressed against the cold mattress felt like a live entity, heat radiating outward, and when she flexed it subtly, she felt something inside shift, a brief, disturbing sensation of movement not under her control. Her mind raced with impossible scenarios. Infection, tumor, something unnatural, her thoughts growing more irrational as the hours stretched. When she finally crawled toward the mirror at the foot of her bed, her reflection startled her. The skin around the bump was faintly darker, a sallow, unhealthy hue that seemed almost iridescent under the dim light, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw it pulse, as if the lump had a heartbeat of its own. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to rationalize, but the sense of wrongness lingered. The faintest whisper of sound reached her ears, a wet, almost sucking noise, synchronized with her pulse, and Mara froze, the hairs on her arms standing on end. She leaned closer, her own breath fogging the mirror, and in that brief reflection, she swore the bump twitched toward her, ever so slightly, as though it were aware of her gaze. By morning, the room smelled faintly of decay, though the apartment had been freshly aired overnight. Mara's elbow throbbed continuously, and when she lifted her sleeve to examine it, the bump had grown larger, its surface taut, shining with an oily, iridescent sheen. The skin around it was dry and peeling, tiny fissures appearing along the edges like miniature fault lines. She pressed gently, and the slight pressure caused a small squelch, followed by a subtle movement beneath the surface, like worms twisting through mud. Mara recoiled, clutching her arm, staring at the reflection in the window pane opposite her bed. For a moment she thought the bump had changed shape, forming what looked like a tiny ridge, almost like an eyelid, pulsing slowly in tandem with her own heartbeat. A shiver crawled down her spine as the hair on her neck rose. The sensation was accompanied by a subtle, sticky warmth spreading toward her shoulder. She tried to shake off the panic, attributing it to nerves and lack of sleep, but the nauseating metallic tang in her mouth betrayed her mind's insistence that something was terribly wrong. The morning commute was unbearable. Mara avoided resting her elbow on the grimy seat or the handrail, clutching her bag tightly, her fingers digging into the fabric as though to remind herself she was still human. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and glimmering, reflecting the gray, overcast sky. Passers-by seemed distant, muted, almost as if she were observing them through a thick layer of fog. Each jolt of the bus, each bump in the road sent a ripple of discomfort through her arm, and with it, the uncanny sensation of movement beneath her skin intensified. She tried to appear composed, smiling awkwardly at a coworker who raised an eyebrow at her awkward posture. In the restroom, she glanced at her reflection, and her pulse quickened as she noticed the small lump quivering subtly, like a living thing, with a barely audible squelch. The skin glistened unnaturally, and a faint odor, a mix of iron and rot, lingered around her elbow. She washed her hands obsessively, hoping the sensation would dissipate, but when she touched the bump again, the slight movement beneath the skin made her gasp aloud, her own reflection showing wide, terrified eyes. Hours later, in the quiet of her studio apartment, Mara tried to distract herself with work, but every time she leaned on her left elbow, the throb returned, now accompanied by a faint but distinct itching that seemed to burrow inward, as though tiny cilia beneath the skin were tracing unfamiliar patterns. She pinched at the bump, and a small droplet of thick, grayish fluid exuded from the surface, its odor sharp and chemical, filling the small room with a nauseating tang. Mara gagged, rushing to the sink to wash it off, but the warmth, the pulsing, the squirming sensation remained, refusing to be scrubbed away. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move in concert with her pulses, stretching, twisting, flickering in the dim lamplight. She curled into a chair, trembling, eyes darting across familiar objects, the coffee mug, the sketchpads, the rain-streaked window, and wondered if anything was truly solid, truly safe. As night fell, the apartment grew colder, the air damp with the scent of rain seeping through the walls. Mara lay on her side, careful to avoid pressing her elbow, yet even in stillness, she felt the movement beneath the skin, the tiny quivers that synchronized disturbingly with her heartbeat. Her mind raced with dark, impossible scenarios. Parasites, mutations, curses, a punishment of her own neglect, some unseen hand etching deformity into her flesh. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by faint squelching sounds, whispers too quiet to identify but seemingly emanating from the bump itself. A thin sheen of sweat coated her forehead, mixing with the metallic, chemical tang lingering in her nose. She dared not touch her arm again, yet her eyes could not leave it, tracing the unnatural ridge, the glistening surface, the imperceptible pulsations that seemed to hint at awareness. And then, in the dead of night, as the city outside slept under a veil of drizzle and mist, Mara's elbow twitched violently, the skin stretching taut and glimmering, a wet squelch escaping as if the bump had opened a tiny, gaping mouth. Her scream caught in her throat as she realized with horror that the lump was no longer passive. It pulsed deliberately, with a rhythm that mirrored her own fear, and for the first time, she sensed intelligence beneath the skin, a sentience that was not hers. The metallic, chemical smell intensified, the sound of wet tissue rubbing against itself amplified in the silence. Mara pressed her hand against her mouth, backing away, but the movement followed, rippling under the surface, advancing slowly, impossibly, and she knew with a sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. Something alive had claimed her body, and she had no idea how to stop it. Mara woke the next morning with a heavy, oppressive feeling in her chest, the lump on her elbow no longer a subtle annoyance but a persistent, throbbing presence demanding her full attention. The room smelled faintly metallic, a coppery tang mixed with a lingering dampness of the Portland drizzle that had seeped in overnight, and her pulse seemed to echo the irregular beating of her arm, the sensation of something moving beneath her skin making her stomach churn. She flexed her elbow carefully, trying not to provoke it, but the bump responded to her movement, rippling outward with a faint, sticky sound, a wet, almost sucking squelch that made her gag. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was a pimple, a cyst, something minor, but the texture had changed. It was no longer soft and pliable but firm in places, yielding and then resisting her touch as if testing her, probing the limits of her own control. She washed her hands obsessively, scrubbing at the sticky residue that clung to her skin, but the odor persisted, a sharp, chemical tang tinged with iron, and when she looked in the mirror, she noticed the skin around the bump was cracked in tiny, branching fissures, some oozing a grayish fluid that smelled faintly of rot. The sight made her stomach turn, but she could not look away, her fingers brushing at the fissures despite the nausea, and as she did, a subtle movement beneath the skin made her recoil in horror, the lump twitching slightly, almost provocatively, like it had a will of its own. At work, she tried to conceal her elbow, wearing long sleeves despite the warmth, but the persistent throb was impossible to ignore, a dull, insistent pain that grew sharper with every motion. Each time she typed, shifted in her chair, or leaned on her arm, the bump responded with tiny pulses that made her wince, a wet squelch sometimes accompanying the movement, faint to anyone else but horrifyingly real to her. She became increasingly aware of a faint odor emanating from her arm, and colleagues began to notice. One, a tall man with a nervous smile, commented awkwardly, "Is that a new cologne? Smells unusual." Mara forced a laugh, blaming it on spilled coffee or lingering printer ink, but her mind raced with dread. Every mirror she passed in the office, frosted glass in the bathroom, reflective surfaces of computer screens, became a source of anxiety, as she thought she saw the lump subtly twitching, its surface glistening unnaturally. During lunch, she tried to ignore the elbow, setting her sandwich on the opposite side of the table, but when she absent-mindedly flexed it, a tiny bead of grayish fluid surfaced at the apex of the bump, glistening wetly. The metallic chemical smell hit her in waves, triggering a wave of nausea, and she excused herself to the restroom, gripping the sink edge as she stared into the mirror. The fissures had widened slightly, small rivulets of fluid slowly oozing down toward her forearm, and as she pressed gently, a subtle quiver beneath the surface made her gasp, the sensation unnerving, almost intimate in its deliberate, conscious movement. Her heartbeat accelerated, a cold sweat coating her palms, and she wondered if she should seek medical attention, but a deep-seated fear rooted in shame and the absurdity of the situation held her back. What would they say if she showed them this? That she had a living, pulsing bump on her elbow, a grotesque deformity seemingly conscious and aware of her gaze? The thought made her stomach knot, and she hurried back to her desk, avoiding contact with her arm, yet unable to stop thinking about the subtle movements, the wet, sticky sensation, and the metallic tang that seemed to cling to her skin like an invisible residue. As the day wore on, the discomfort intensified, and Mara felt an almost unbearable itch beneath the skin, a crawling sensation that made her twitch involuntarily in her chair. She tried to concentrate on her work, but every line she drew seemed to blur, every color bled slightly on the screen, her own vision betraying her focus. She caught herself flexing her elbow repeatedly, almost compulsively, feeling the lump respond, the skin around it stretching taut, small beads of grayish fluid forming and disappearing in a grotesque cycle that made her stomach churn. The sound, subtle but unmistakable, of tissue moving beneath her skin accompanied each movement, a faint squelch, almost like soft leather writhing. By mid-afternoon, she began to notice new symptoms. The skin around the bump was reddened, inflamed, and a faint sticky crust had formed along the edges, oozing occasionally when she brushed it inadvertently. Tiny black specks appeared within the fluid, moving slowly in patterns that made her stare in horror, certain that she was imagining them. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, the evidence persisted. Panic rose in her chest. She felt the beginnings of social isolation as she noticed colleagues subtly recoiling, glancing at her elbow with curiosity or disgust. Her friend Jenna asked casually if she had brushed against something at the studio, her tone a mixture of concern and awkwardness. Mara smiled nervously, brushing off the question, but inside, a deep, gnawing shame festered. She wanted to hide, to crawl into the safety of her apartment, away from prying eyes, but the lump pulsed continuously, its movements now deliberate, almost mocking. By evening, The discomfort had escalated to a sharp, gnawing pain. She sank onto her sofa, arm held gingerly in the air, staring at the small mound of flesh that now looked distinctly abnormal. The surface had a faint iridescence, and she was certain she could see subtle undulations beneath the skin, the grayish fluid thickening slightly. Her mind, in desperation, sought rational explanations. Cyst, abscess, infection, but the sensations defied logic. A low, wet, squelching noise accompanied the minor movements, audible enough in the silence of the apartment to make her recoil. She flexed the elbow gently, and the bump rippled, the fissures widening, a thin strand of fluid glistening along the curve of her forearm. Mara's breath caught as she realized it was moving of its own accord, subtly but unmistakably, shifting in tiny increments that synchronized with her own heartbeat. The smell intensified, a mixture of rust, chemicals, and decay, filling her small apartment with nausea. She pressed a cold washcloth to the bump, hoping for relief, but the movement persisted, the surface undulating beneath the fabric as if aware of her attempts to suppress it. Mara's anxiety spiraled further that night. She lay in bed, careful not to touch the elbow, yet every shift of her body caused a pulse of discomfort, a wet squelch, a sensation of something probing under the skin. Shadows in the corners of her room seemed to stretch, flicker, and breathe with her movements, and the metallic smell lingered even after she opened windows to air the apartment. In the quiet, she could hear faint noises, squelches, soft wet pops, subtle rhythmic pulsations, that she knew could not be coming from her imagination alone. Her dreams were fractured, filled with visions of crawling skin, blackened fissures, and tiny eyes opening within flesh, watching, aware, waiting. She awoke in a cold sweat, arm bent slightly to avoid pressing the bump, only to find that the lump had grown slightly overnight. The fissures were more pronounced, thin threads of grayish fluid glinting under the morning light. When she flexed gently, the wet squelch was louder now, and she could see a subtle movement, almost a wave, pass beneath the skin, the surface shimmering faintly. Her stomach twisted in terror, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to suppress a scream. She dared not show anyone, but the isolation grew unbearable. Each interaction with friends or coworkers was punctuated by glances, whispers, the subtle recognition that something about her was off. Mara avoided mirrors, avoided physical contact, avoided even thinking about the bump, yet it remained omnipresent, pulsing, alive, mocking her. That evening, as rain pounded against the windows once more, Mara attempted to distract herself with work, sketching vaguely, but every time she leaned on her left arm, the sensation returned with renewed intensity. The bump seemed to writhe, subtle undulations moving across the surface, the grayish fluid thickening, tiny black specks drifting within, slowly coalescing into patterns she could not comprehend. The metallic chemical smell filled her apartment, and the faint squelching noises accompanied each movement, each twitch of her pulse. Panic surged in waves. She attempted to sleep, curling carefully to avoid contact with the arm, but even in the dark, she could feel it pulsing beneath the skin, wriggling almost imperceptibly, alive, aware. She imagined her own flesh betraying her, tiny creatures moving beneath the surface, burrowing, watching, learning. Her mind teetered on the edge of hysteria, alternating between rational explanations and irrational fear. She finally dared to glance at the mirror. The lump seemed to shimmer, the fissures more pronounced, glistening with a thick, grayish fluid. And then, in the reflection, she swore she saw a subtle twitch, almost a nod, almost an acknowledgement, an imperceptible movement that seemed to defy natural causality. Her breath hitched. The metallic, chemical odor intensified, mingling with a faint, sulphurous note that made her gag. Her hand hovered near the bump, trembling, but she could not bring herself to touch it. It pulsed again, and this time, the movement seemed deliberate, almost communicative, a subtle wave passing through the taut, glistening skin, synchronized with her pulse. Mara backed away from the mirror, heart racing, a cold sweat running down her spine. The apartment felt impossibly small, claustrophobic, every shadow threatening, every reflection hiding some unseen horror. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees, listening to the faint squelch, the metallic pulse, the whispering sensation that seemed to emanate from the bump itself, and realized with dawning terror that this was no ordinary pimple. Something alive had taken root beneath her skin, something sentient, something growing, something that knew her, watched her, and perhaps waited for the moment to consume not just her flesh but her identity, her sanity, her very self. And then, as the clock ticked in the oppressive silence, the bump twitched violently, the fissures spreading rapidly, and a thin strand of gray fluid shot outward, landing across the floor. Mara's scream caught in her throat as she stared, frozen, paralyzed, knowing in the deepest, most primal part of her being that nothing in her life would ever be normal again. Ethan, a 38-year-old graphic designer living in a cramped apartment in Seattle, had always been meticulous about his appearance, his routines, his health, but the sudden emergence of the lump in his left ear shattered that fragile sense of control. It started innocuously, a tiny discomfort, a dull pressure inside the cartilage, easily dismissed as a wax buildup or a minor irritation from earbuds, but over the course of a few days, it grew rapidly, the size now grotesque, pressing outward in a pulsing, bulbous mass that distorted the shape of his ear entirely. The first night he noticed it, the sensation was subtle yet insistent, a creeping warmth beneath the skin, as if something were breathing, alive, and pushing outward. He attempted to massage the area gently, hoping to reduce the pressure, but the skin felt oddly elastic and resistant, stretching in unnatural ways, rippling beneath his fingers. The moment he touched it, a faint, wet squelching sound echoed, audible in the silence of his apartment, and a metallic tang hit his nose, sharp and nauseating. Ethan recoiled, heart pounding, staring at the mirror as the ear seemed to shiver slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if aware of his gaze. Over the next few days, the lump expanded, the skin taut and glistening, with thin veins visible beneath the surface, pulsating in sync with his heartbeat. Tiny fissures appeared at the edges, oozing a grayish, sticky fluid with a smell reminiscent of rust mixed with decay, a scent that made his stomach twist and sent waves of panic through him. Each time he touched the area to clean or inspect it, subtle movements beneath the skin made him jump. The mass seemed to shift, tiny undulations passing through it in a deliberate, sentient rhythm. At work, Ethan struggled to conceal the deformity, but the sensation was relentless. Every sound, every vibration, every slight touch against his head triggered a pulse of pain, a wet squelch that echoed faintly, terrifyingly real, and the faint chemical metallic odor clung stubbornly, perceptible even to himself and occasionally to others. Colleagues began to notice. One, a quiet man with spectacles, commented in hushed tones, "Ethan, is your ear okay? It smells funny." Ethan forced a laugh, citing a new shampoo or perhaps a wax problem, but the dread within him deepened. Each mirror, each reflective surface became a torment, as he could swear he saw the lump twitch, the surface undulating minutely in ways inconsistent with normal flesh. The swelling intensified overnight, the ear distended, the skin stretched unnaturally thin in places, almost translucent. When he pressed gently, a thin grayish strand of fluid emerged from a small fissure, glistening wetly and leaving a subtle trail across his jawline. He gagged at the scent, a nauseating blend of metallic tang and something decayed, organic, and knew he had to act, yet shame, disbelief, and fear of judgment held him back from seeking immediate medical help. The relentless discomfort began to erode his concentration, each sound amplified within the cavity of the ear, each pulse of pain radiating through his skull in rhythm with his own heartbeat, the bump almost sentient in its insistence. His sleep became fragmented, punctuated by dreams in which the lump moved on its own, elongating, wriggling, pulsating, sending filaments through his veins, whispering words he could not comprehend, and each time he awoke, the lump seemed slightly larger, subtly altered, as if feeding on his fear. In public, he became increasingly self-conscious, keeping his head tilted to the right, avoiding physical contact, avoiding phone calls that required hands-free devices, anything that might draw attention to his deformity. Social interactions grew strained. Friends noticed his pale complexion, the dark circles under his eyes, the subtle but insistent twitching of his ear as he sat in conversation. He began to isolate himself, hiding behind headphones, avoiding conversations, meals, gatherings, preferring the solitude of his apartment where he could monitor the lump without scrutiny. Yet in solitude, the horror only intensified. The lump throbbed relentlessly, the fissures widening, the grayish fluid pooling in tiny droplets along the edge of his earlobe. He pressed a cold towel to it, but the mass pulsed beneath, shifting slightly, the sensation of crawling, of wriggling just under the surface, making him jump, flinch, recoil. He began to hear subtle noises in the quiet, wet squelches, faint rhythmic pulsations, almost a whisper that seemed synchronized with the movement of the lump. His reflection became unbearable. In mirrors and windows, he sometimes thought he saw the ear twitch in ways impossible for normal tissue, slight convulsions, ripples, a surface sheen that shimmered unnaturally. The skin around the mass became inflamed, stretched, thin, and the fissures leaked steadily, the fluid thickening, the black specks within it moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Panic became a constant companion, anxiety clawing at him with each pulse, each squelch, each metallic odor. He attempted to clean the area obsessively, but no matter how many washes, the smell persisted, the grayish ooze seemed to resist removal, and the tiny black specks remained, shifting imperceptibly beneath the fluid surface. At night, the sensations were unbearable. Lying on his side to sleep caused the lump to press against the pillow, pain shooting through his jaw and skull, the surface squelching audibly, ripples of movement coursing beneath the skin, and sometimes a faint whispering sound, as if the lump itself were breathing, alive, aware. Ethan became obsessed with documenting the changes, taking photographs, writing notes, measuring dimensions, trying to rationalize, quantify, contain the horror, but each observation only confirmed the unthinkable. The mass was growing, changing, pulsating with a life of its own. Desperation led him to research online, medical journals, forums, obscure case studies, but nothing matched the living, conscious sensation he felt. Some terms, abscess, cyst, infection, were close, but none accounted for the deliberate movements, the wet squelching, the pulsating, the whispers, the smell of decay. He considered visiting a doctor but hesitated, imagining their disbelief, their horror, the inevitable questions about hygiene or sanity. Even so, the worsening condition forced him to schedule an appointment, though dread gnawed at him. The days leading to the visit were torturous. The lump grew further, the fissures deepening, the gray fluid glistening like thick sap along the contours of his ear. The black specks, tiny, imperceptible at first, now seemed to move with intention, drifting, converging, forming faint. Ethan awoke that morning with a creeping sense of dread, the kind that burrows deep into the bones, the lump in his left ear throbbing violently, pulsing with a life that seemed entirely independent of his own, the skin stretched to a near-translucent sheen, veins visible beneath, tiny black specks swirling and forming almost sentient patterns, and he recoiled as the grayish, viscous fluid glistened along the fissures, dripping slightly onto the pillow, the metallic, decayed odor invading his nostrils with unbearable intensity, the apartment air thick with the smell, suffocating, pressing against him as if the room itself were complicit in the horror. His heartbeat rising in frantic, irregular pulses, echoing against the walls of the cramped Seattle apartment, each pulse seemingly synchronized with the movements of the alien mass that had taken residence in his ear, and every tiny undulation, every subtle shift of the lump sent shivers down his spine, a mixture of fear, revulsion, and helplessness washing over him, compelling him to approach the mirror, though he knew what he would see would be a grotesque distortion of himself, his reflection alien and obscene, the left ear grotesquely swollen, fissures widening, fluid glistening, tiny black specks shifting with eerie precision, forming arcs and spirals that seemed to mock him, and when he tilted his head, he could see them undulate in patterns that were almost hypnotic, almost alive, whispering something he could not comprehend but felt deep in his gut, a primal recognition of malevolence, of a life form feeding on him, growing stronger, more deliberate with every hour, and as he touched the lump tentatively, the skin felt strangely warm, almost hot, a pulsing thrum beneath his fingers, and then the worst moment came. A subtle movement, a small protrusion at one fissure that looked disturbingly like a minuscule appendage, a tiny hand or claw wriggling, and he jumped back, gagging at the stench of decay and metallic tang, the lump now fully conscious, pulsating, wriggling with a will of its own, and each movement sent spasms of pain radiating through his skull, through his jaw, through the nerves of his face, and he staggered backward, the room spinning slightly, shadows stretching, walls breathing, as if the apartment had become an extension of the monstrosity within him, and he realized that whatever this was, it was no longer part of him in any familiar sense. It had become something alien, parasitic and aware, its presence pressing insistently on his mind as much as on his flesh, a relentless sentient horror, mocking his helplessness, and he heard it, a wet, deliberate squelching sound, accompanied by a whisper, faint but insistent, syllables he could not parse, a voice emanating from within the lump itself, and the more he stared, the more it seemed to grow, undulate, the fissures opening wider, the gray fluid oozing in slow, deliberate pulses, each black speck moving with intention, and he realized with abject terror that the mass was expanding at an alarming rate, deforming the surrounding tissue, stretching the cartilage of the ear into shapes that should not exist in human anatomy, ridges and bulges forming, surfaces glistening with a wet sheen of decay, and when he pressed lightly to investigate, the lump reacted, contracting, pulsing, the tiny protrusions writhing as if alive, sending sharp bursts of pain up his nerves, and the whispers became clearer. more insistent, repeating sounds that resembled words, phrases, almost sentences, in a language he could not consciously understand but instinctively feared, and panic overtook him, his mind racing, imagining every grotesque possibility, every unimaginable mutation, every physical betrayal of the human form. The thought that he could be consumed entirely by this entity, this alien, parasitic, sentient mass growing from his own flesh, controlling, shaping, dominating him, and he stumbled to the bathroom, clutching his head, desperate for reflection, for evidence, for proof that his mind had not entirely abandoned him. But when he turned toward the mirror, he recoiled in horror, for the reflection staring back was no longer fully his own, the left ear grotesque, swelling outward, surface glistening with viscous gray fluid, fissures now deep, almost gaping, tiny black specks coalescing into distinct patterns, almost forming miniature eyes, almost forming mouths that whispered, gurgled, hissed, the flesh rippling with movement that seemed coordinated, deliberate, aware, and as he watched, a subtle movement beneath the skin caught his attention, a wriggling line that elongated and split, branching like tiny veins, tendrils moving toward the earlobe, and then, impossibly, from the largest fissure, a small protuberance emerged, elongating into something resembling a miniature tongue or limb, wet, glistening, writhing, curling as if testing the air, sensing, tasting, observing. And he screamed, dropping to the floor, hands clutching the sides of his head, the pain sharp and relentless, each pulse of the lump reverberating through his nerves, a relentless signal of alien life, and he began to rock back and forth, whispering to himself, begging himself to wake up, to somehow revert to normalcy, but the sensation only intensified, a chorus of wet squelches, rhythmic, deliberate, synchronized with his heartbeat, a wet, breathing, sentient horror attached to him, a parasite feeding on his fear, his flesh, his very identity, and the room seemed to warp around him, walls bending, shadows elongating, floorboards groaning, a surreal, nightmarish distortion of familiar reality as the lump expanded, a grotesque, living presence, reshaping his ear, infiltrating his nerves, integrating with him, and when he attempted to move or touch it, the appendage twitched violently, pain radiating through his skull, through the jaw, through the neck, as if his own nervous system had become a conduit for the entity's will, and he could feel tiny movements, like crawling threads, beneath the skin, spreading, exploring, probing, insidious, and with each motion, he felt. Ethan staggered into the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital, the pungent, metallic stench of decay still clinging to him, searing his nostrils, his left ear grotesquely swollen, fissured, and pulsating violently, the gray fluid glistening along the edges, black specks writhing and forming almost intentional patterns as he navigated the narrow corridor, each step sending jolts of pain from the nerve endings around the monstrous growth. His reflection in the polished metal surfaces distorted, alien, horrifying, the whispering inside his head now clearer, taunting, commanding, pulsating in rhythm with the lump's movements, insisting, insinuating, mocking, and he could feel the appendages probing deeper into his skull, testing, sensing, asserting dominance, and as he reached the small examination room, the antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed grotesquely with the fetid stench of his own body, a nauseating contrast that made his stomach churn, his pulse hammering in his temples, a wet squelching sound emanating from his ear each time he moved, each time the entity within reacted to his fear, and when the doctor entered, a young man with carefully combed brown hair and nervous eyes, Ethan tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling noise emerged, a horrifying mockery of speech, and the doctor recoiled slightly, uncertain, concerned, but unaware of the full scale of the horror, and Ethan felt a desperate surge of frustration and shame, realizing that even in this sterile, controlled environment, he was utterly alien, utterly monstrous, utterly lost, and as he raised his hand to point at the ear, the lump pulsed violently, wriggling with a life of its own, shooting pain up his nerves, and the doctor, noticing the swelling, frowned, approaching cautiously, speaking softly. "We'll take a look. It might just be an infection or a cyst." But Ethan could feel the entities were resisting, almost sensing the intrusion, pulling at his nerves, forcing his body into minor twitches and jerks, a subtle, wet, grotesque symphony of rebellion, and when the doctor gently touched the lump, the gray fluid thickened, oozing along the fissures, black specks wriggling with sudden, deliberate coordination, and a wet, squelching sound filled the room, echoing off the sterile tiles, making the young man step back, alarm flashing across his face, and Ethan realized, with abject terror, that any attempt at intervention only provoked the entity, that it was aware, responsive, and fully integrated with his nervous system, a sentient parasite, mocking any attempt at salvation. Yet he had no choice but to proceed, desperate for relief, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, some hope of returning to a world that had once been mundane, safe, and familiar. And as the doctor prepared gloves, instruments, antiseptic, Ethan's mind raced, memories of his life, his friends, the apartment, the job, the sense of being ordinary, of being human, all clashing violently with the grotesque reality of his transformed flesh, his left ear now unrecognizable, a pulsating, writhing mass, glistening with viscous gray fluid, black specks forming arcs and spirals, appendages probing nervously into the fissures, exploring, asserting, communicating in ways he could barely comprehend. And as the doctor examined the lump with gentle pressure, Ethan flinched, pain radiating up the jaw, skull, neck, a deep, visceral throb. And then came the first incision, small, precise, the antiseptic smell mingling with a metallic decay, and the entity reacted instantly, quivering violently, pulses of pain shooting through Ethan's nervous system, appendages twitching and wriggling, black specks rearranging themselves as if observing the intrusion, assessing, responding, and the doctor, unaware of the sentience, murmured reassurances. "We'll just remove the infection, clean it out." But Ethan knew instinctively that there was no infection, no ordinary cyst, only something alien, parasitic and fully alive, integrated with his flesh, his nerves, and his mind. And as the scalpel met the fleshy, pulsating surface, gray fluid oozing immediately into the sterile tray, a black speck detached and twitched violently, as if alive, and Ethan screamed, a wet, gurgling, inhuman sound, echoing in the small room, making the doctor freeze, eyes wide, and he felt the entity shift, pulse violently, its appendages writhing under the skin, probing, resisting, asserting, and then, impossibly, the incision widened slightly on its own, the flesh rippling with movements entirely alien, almost like tiny tendrils testing the new opening, exploring the environment, sensing, reacting, and Ethan's vision blurred with tears, the pain unbearable, the whispers inside his head now coherent, wet, gurgling words, mocking him, promising, taunting, the entity fully aware of the attempt to remove it, fully alive, fully malicious. And he realized in despair that the doctor's tools were insufficient, his knowledge powerless, that no ordinary procedure could excise a living, sentient parasite integrated with his flesh and nerves, and yet, there was a fleeting glimmer of hope. After a tense, agonizing hour, with careful incisions, suction, antiseptic, and a battle of wills, a portion of the lump was removed, an oozing, black-speckled, grayish mass placed into a sterile container, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt a subtle relief, a pause in the relentless pulsing, a momentary lightness, a sense that perhaps there was a path forward, a possibility that he might return to some semblance of normalcy. But as he breathed in the antiseptic air, his mind racing, the whispers began again, faint at first, almost imperceptible, the wet, squelching rhythm returning, appendages twitching beneath the skin, black specks rearranging, and then he felt it, a subtle tickle, a creeping sensation on the scalp, on the neck, a pulse beneath his remaining skin that mirrored the entity's movement, an undeniable presence, proving that the horror had not fully receded, that even though part of the mass had been excised, something remained, something sentient, alive, integrated, waiting, observing. And as he left the hospital, walking down the corridor, the sterile smell of disinfectant mingling with a metallic, decayed stench still clinging to him, he realized fully that the relief was temporary, illusory, a false hope, and that his body, his mind, his very identity, were still under siege. And in the quiet of the evening, walking the dimly lit streets back to his apartment, shadows stretching, streetlights flickering, the whispers now audibly gurgling, wet, deliberate, he understood that the entity was patient, adaptive, unrelenting, that the battle for his flesh, his consciousness, his humanity, was far from over, and when he touched the left ear, now reduced in size but still swollen, fissured, he felt a faint wriggle beneath the skin, a pulse that was alien, deliberate, sentient, and he shivered, a mixture of relief and abject terror, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long, uncertain struggle, that the parasite, the sentient alien mass, still inhabited him, still controlled, still observed, still whispered, and that no procedure, no medicine, no hope, could ever fully remove the horror that had claimed him. And as he entered his apartment, the shadows deepened, the air thick with metallic decay, the lump throbbed faintly, and the whispers, now soft but unmistakable, repeated his name, a sinister lullaby, a promise, a threat, and Ethan realized with absolute, paralyzing clarity that the entity had not been defeated. Ethan returned to his apartment that evening, the city lights outside casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, the air thick with a metallic decayed stench that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. His left ear still swollen, fissured, a faint, imperceptible pulse beneath the skin signaling the sentience that remained. The whispers soft but insistent, wet gurgling sounds that seemed to seep into his very thoughts, taunting, coaxing, reminding him that the entity had survived, adapted, that the partial removal in the hospital had been nothing more than a temporary setback for the parasite that now claimed his body, and as he sat on the edge of the worn couch, the dim light flickering from a single lamp, he could feel a subtle wriggle beneath the flesh, tendrils probing, assessing, as if the horror itself was testing the boundaries of its new environment. And Ethan's reflection in the grimy windowpane was alien, distorted, a mask of pain and terror, the skin around the ear discolored, veined, occasionally twitching independently as if the entity's consciousness extended through his nervous system, an ever-present, insidious presence, and he tried to distract himself with mundane tasks, pouring a glass of water, attempting to eat. But each movement was accompanied by a wet squelch from the ear, a subtle, horrifying vibration that resonated through the skull, echoing along the nerves, whispering his name, mocking his attempts at normalcy, and when he touched it, the flesh squirmed softly, a pulse that was deliberate, sentient, and horrifyingly patient, and as the night deepened, the apartment seemed to shrink, walls pressing closer, shadows stretching unnaturally, the hum of the refrigerator and distant city sounds twisting into grotesque echoes, every noise amplifying the tension, every flicker of light a sinister signal, and Ethan's dreams that night were a collage of grotesque hallucinations. The ear transformed into a pulsating black, speckled mound writhing with appendages, small, twitching limbs that probed his scalp, face, neck, exploring, asserting, whispering. Voices layered atop one another, wet, gurgling, sinisterly coherent, some repeating past conversations, some issuing commands, some just mocking, taunting, and in this dreamscape, he saw himself reflected in mirrors not as a man but as a host, a vessel, flesh partially foreign, partially his own, veins and nerves rearranged, black specks crawling beneath the skin, in deliberate, sentient patterns, and when he awoke in the dim pre-dawn light, sweat coating his body, the whispers were still there, faint, rhythmic, a pulse beneath the ear that seemed almost in sync with his heartbeat, a wet squelching sensation that made him flinch involuntarily, and the gray fluid that had diminished during the hospital procedure had returned, oozing subtly along fissures, black specks rearranging themselves, watching, sensing, a constant reminder that the parasite was patient, waiting, integrated fully with his body, his mind, his identity, and Ethan felt the profound terror of knowing that the struggle was not external but internal, a war fought beneath the skin, beneath the nerves, within the essence of his own flesh, and in an attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, he sought medical advice again, visiting clinics, specialists, trying every antibiotic, antiseptic, and experimental treatment, but each intervention only seemed to irritate the entity, provoking subtle pulses, wriggles, wet squelches that echoed through his skull, and the doctors, baffled, concerned, empathetic yet helpless, could offer nothing beyond sterile interventions, and the contrast between the clean, bright hospital rooms and the grotesque, alien presence within his body was almost unbearable, every antiseptic smell clashing violently with the metallic, decayed odor emanating from the ear, every bright light emphasizing the shadow lurking beneath his flesh, and Ethan began to withdraw, avoiding friends, avoiding work, avoiding any social contact, each interaction a potential revelation of his transformed, grotesque body, each conversation a risk that someone might notice, smell, see, understand, and he became hyper-aware of every twitch, every pulse, every wet squelch, imagining the black specks under the skin rearranging, planning, observing, always aware, always sentient, and the whispers evolved, no longer merely taunting but insinuating, suggesting, urging, a subtle but constant manipulation, making him doubt his own perceptions, his own actions, his own sanity, and one evening, in the quiet solitude of his apartment, he felt something unprecedented. The lump shifted violently, wriggling with coordination, a sudden, deliberate movement, the black specks converging to form a pattern, almost an eye, and the whispers synchronized, wet, gurgling words forming a sentence, clear, deliberate, undeniably sentient. "You are mine," and the sensation was unbearable, the pulse violent, penetrating every nerve, sending jolts of pain through his skull, face, jaw, neck, and Ethan dropped to the floor, clutching his head, sobbing, a wet, gurgling sound escaping from his throat, realizing fully that the entity had not only survived but had grown stronger, more coordinated, more aware, and his body was no longer his own, a vessel for something patient, insidious, horrifyingly alive. And the walls of the apartment seemed to close in, shadows, stretching into impossible forms. The ambient sounds of the city twisted into wet, gurgling echoes, as if the world itself had joined in the entity's observation. And when he dared to look in the bathroom mirror, his own reflection was subtly wrong, ear swollen, skin discolored, faint black specks visible beneath the surface, subtle wriggling movements under the flesh, and he realized with paralyzing clarity that he had become a hybrid, partially himself, partially the sentient horror embedded in his flesh, a host and prisoner simultaneously. And as he sat on the cold tile floor, feeling the wet pulse beneath his ear, he noticed for the first time a faint creaking from his bones, subtle, rhythmic, synchronized with a wriggle, and an instinctive terror gripped him. Perhaps the entity could extend further, perhaps more of him would become consumed, perhaps nothing about him remained fully human, and yet, he felt a strange, perverse connection. The entity almost communicating, demanding, insinuating, promising, asserting dominance, and the fear was absolute, overwhelming, yet coupled with a morbid curiosity, a fascination with the grotesque reality of his existence. And the hours passed in a blur of twitching flesh, wet squelches, whispers, and dark reflection. And when he finally dared to rest, laying on the tattered couch, the dim city lights casting distorted shadows across the room, the pulse beneath his ear slowed, almost imperceptible, the wet gurgling quieted to a faint rhythm, and he felt a fleeting, fragile sense of relief, a temporary reprieve, a momentary suspension of terror. But as his eyelids drooped, as sleep threatened, he heard it again, faint, wet, deliberate, a whisper in his mind, synchronized with a subtle wriggle beneath the skin, soft but unmistakable, repeating his name, claiming him, reminding him that the struggle, the horror, the sentient parasite was patient, eternal, and that it would endure. And Ethan understood fully, with the final, paralyzing clarity of someone who has